Yeah, it says, oh, there we are, yes.
Yes. Well, hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. And tonight's topic, I should say, I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And I'm joined tonight by my friend, Dee Piers, who is the host of of Around the World with Dee and Friends.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
I slipped there for a moment. Our topic for tonight is the return of neoliberalism and the birth of the new economic patriotism. And as we move forward tonight, it will become clear what the new economic patriotism is. I'll start off by sharing a piece from the American Prospect. Let me grab it for you. There it is. It's called A Spending Cap in Name Only, and it's by Dave Dayen.
He's very good. I like Dave Day.
Yeah, the editor-in-chief of the Prospect, who has a long and checkered career. A very good career, actually. A spending cap in name only. In our final X date, okay, that was a series dealing with the debt ceiling crisis. This is the final installment in that series. We note how Congress is already scheming to avoid restrictions on military spending. Of course, it's a neoliberal Congress. Of course,
Yep.
they avoid actually accepting restrictions on military spending. Okay, today was supposed to be the actual X date upon which the federal government would run out of money. Instead, Congress passed and the president signed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the FRA, suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years. So we're using today to round out our series on this absurd few weeks in American politics. We hope to never again have to create a pop-up newsletter to cover the threat of a catastrophic, deliberate default on the nation's debt. But since this deal did nothing to extinguish that possibility, we will save the X-Date logo for 2025. He figures he's going to have to use it again.
Hmm.
At this point, I do want to mention two things. First, as most of you know by now, it is forbidden by the 14th Amendment, Section 4, to question, the validity of the United States debt, of the U.S. debt, debts of the United States. Of course, what these politicians have all been doing over a period of time, in fact, what even a negotiation on the debt is doing over a period of time, is to call into question, okay, the validity of the debt by even contemplating that it would be valid and legal to question, okay, the debt. But not only is there a prohibition in the 14th Amendment, there is also a law which is on the books, has been on the federal books for a long time, which says that questioning the debt, okay, is illegal, okay, and is punishable, if I recall correctly, by a $1,000 fine and or 10 years in prison. So in other words,
It's crazy.
it may be crazy, but okay, in other words, it would have been legal for the Attorney General to arrest the Congress people who were questioning the validity of the debt by refusing to pass a clean debt ceiling bill. Now, there are not too many people who know about that, but uh, that was mentioned a few times during the crises, the debt ceiling crises of 2011 and 2013. The existence of that law was uncovered by Carlos Mucha, who was also the person uh, who brought forward the proposal and who showed, okay, the legality of the proposal to mint high value platinum coins. He was the inventor of the idea of high value platinum coin seigniorage. But anyway, he also dug that one up. So, going on with the article, we have discussed in detail what the FRA will mean for public policy. Hey, the FRA again is the Fiscal Responsibility Act. I should say the so called Fiscal Responsibility Act, because in fact, it is really the faux Fiscal Responsibility Act and should have been called the FFRA, because in making a debt ceiling compromise on grounds that the deficit and the public debt are problems, and therefore that it is fiscally responsible to reduce the deficit and to reduce the debt, that is false. And that's why this is the faux Fiscal Responsibility Act. But going on, we have discussed in detail what the FRA will mean for public policy, from more paperwork for poor people seeking federal benefits to a pipeline payoff that renders a future permitting permitting reform deal more difficult, to the ways in which Congress reasserted its role in checking the judiciary. Uh, with respect to the pipeline payoff, given what we're in the middle of right now, I have to call attention to the air outside, which evidently is bad across the whole East Coast running as far south, I believe, as the Carolinas. But furthermore, the worst there seems to have been recorded in New York City and in DC. So, but going on, uh, of course, when Dave says, when he points out to the ways in which Congress reasserted its role in checking the judiciary, what he's referring to there is the Mountain Valley Pipeline, the MVP, in writing this provision into the Debt Ceiling Act to allow the permitting of that activity rapidly, uh, Congress also put in a clause saying that that part of the law could not be reviewed by the judiciary. It used its jurisdiction stripping power finally on the judiciary. It never used it with respect to the Voting Rights Acts. Okay, it never used it with respect to measures that were designed to end gerrymandering. Okay, it never used it with respect to proposing laws to codify by Roe v. Wade, but it used its jurisdiction stripping power to prevent the judiciary from actually reviewing the constitutionality of that law. Going on. But since the centerpiece of this deal is a spending cap, we'll close X state by explaining how it is not likely to be a cap, okay, at all. I've said previously that the CBO claim that this bill will cut 1.5 trillion in federal spending is unreliable. That's not the budget office's fault. There are side deals that both sides claim to be part of the agreement that CBO didn't score because they aren't in the law's text. Those side deals will take rescinded COVID aid and IRS funding and plow it into the non-defense discretionary side of the budget. So it just about gets to the level of fiscal year 2023. And that is to say, the non-defense discretionary side of the budget. If that were to happen, that, of course, would improve the compromise somewhat. Not by much, but it would improve it by somewhat. Since that would create a new baseline about 40 billion higher for fiscal year 2024, it changes all of CBO's assumptions on spending in the subsequent years. Plus, after 2025, the caps are lifted, and while CBO just assumes spending will then rise at the rate of inflation, it will be the 2024 election that determines the trajectory. That election is shaping up to be monumental in terms of fiscal policy. The spending caps, the Trump tax cuts, including the changes to the child tax credit, the boosted subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, and this debt ceiling suspension all expire after the election in 2025. The best read on the actual cuts from this agreement is about 136 billion, with everything else a wild card. Now, I don't even think the 136 billion is going to be reliable because uh, if we should get a recession during this period of time and the automatic stabilizers kick in, okay, in the recession, uh, that would increase the spending and would create a new economic situation. But that's only if the annual 12 spending bills pass Congress. If they don't, an automatic but continuing resolution, very often called a CR, will impose a new discretionary spending cap with a 1% cut to fiscal year 2023 levels. This mostly slams the defense side of the budget, which is actually scheduled for a 3% increase under the deal, with what amounts to close to a 10% cut in real terms. Now, of course, here Dave is assuming a particular inflation rate. The auto CR is intended to enforce the side deals, also, by the way, is uncertain because inflation is coming down very fast. The auto CR is intended to enforce the side deals, although some House Democrats think Republicans will be all too happy to automate further budget cuts. Yes, to the domestic side, of course. As I've written, if you believe the Pentagon, this is Dave again, gets too much money and the IRS too little, the auto CR is perhaps your friend, since in addition to slashing military spending, it would preserve most IRS funding from being rescinded, but would also extinguish some side deals that designate 23 billion in domestic spending as emergency, quote unquote, outside the caps, and cut domestic budgets even beyond that by a bit. I also tend to think that there will be enormous lobbyist pressure to pass the spending bills and eradicate the existential threat of the military having to get by with a paltry $849 billion in 1 year. What are we supposed to get by with? A mere 10 aircraft carriers? Like some kind of peasant country, says Dave? In fact, the loudest voices on Capitol Hill are saying that even the boosted Pentagon budget, up to $886 billion in this deal, is entirely too low. And they've already figured out a way around it. One of the reasons for the unusually lightning fast Senate passage of the deal, outside of making sure nobody's Summer Friday was trifled with, was that Senate defense hawks demanded and got what amounts to a commitment for votes on a supplemental spending bill later in the year that adds military spending. That means going above the $886 billion cap, maybe well above it. This will be sold as part of an urgent request to funnel more money to Ukraine's war against Russia. But the defense hawks are being quite open about how they will attach funding that has nothing to do with Ukraine to that. Quote, yeah, probably they want to go after China with that. Quote, there will be a day before too long where we'll have to deal with the Ukrainian situation. And that will create an opportunity for me and others to fill in the deficiencies that exist from the budget deal, unquote, Senator Lindsey Slimeball Graham said bluntly to reporters on Thursday. The slitherer. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer read a statement on the Senate floor Thursday night intended to, quote, reassure our friends across the world about the Senate's commitment and ability to respond to emerging threats and needs. Schumer said that, quote, the debt ceiling deal does nothing to limit the Senate's ability to appropriate emergency supplemental funds to ensure our military capabilities are sufficient to deter Russia and our other adversaries and respond to ongoing and growing national security threats, unquote. I find that interesting. I guess what I would say is that the debt ceiling deal does nothing to limit the Senate's ability to appropriate emergency supplemental funds to ensure that our economy does not tank or that poor people go hungry or that we suddenly decide to pass a Medicare for all bill. In other words, this deal doesn't really bind the Senate or the House at all. It's just there to say to people, oh, we can't do that because we had this debt ceiling deal. That's BS. As fast as they pass this deal, in the end, they can break it just as fast if conditions arise, such as how practically overnight, when they decided COVID was an emergency, they passed the CARES Act. There wasn't even enough time for the Congress people to read the damn thing. So we got to keep that in mind. They may say this deal freezes things for 2 years, but their minds can be changed by a sufficiently powerful political movement. There's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits them from saying, screw the FRA, we need to do other things for people. It's up to us to try to force them to do those other things for people. Going on, that was the condition for speedy passage of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The language was negotiated between the parties in the Senate. It connects the supplemental funds to military capabilities, not just overseas assistance to Ukraine. Everyone understands what's about to happen here. The military, quote, caps, unquote, are a joke. What I say is, let's ensure that the domestic policy caps are also a joke, because they ought to be a joke. At the end of the statement, Schumer said, quote, nor does this debt ceiling limit the Senate's ability to appropriate emergency supplemental funds to respond to various national issues, such as disaster relief, combating the fentanyl crisis, or other issues of national importance. Unquote. That was a Democratic insertion and a potential opportunity. We've seen supplemental deals struck before that pair military and non-military spending, so each side gets something. A Ukraine supplemental could be the vehicle for that. Many House MAGA types have been rallying against another Ukraine supplemental, but we've seen in this debt ceiling deal that they do not have unilateral influence over their caucus. There will be an enormous amount of demagoguery over that supplemental. The entire Pentagon funding smuggled through in the name of Ukraine won't be the extra Pentagon funding smuggled through in the name of Ukraine won't be discussed. Whether enough Democratic votes are needed to create parity in the deal with some more funding for domestic priorities remains to be seen. Still, there is another opportunity here. Democrats could demand domestic priorities in the supplemental by threatening to deny votes on other spending bills. Once again, if the spending bills fail, then military spending would suffer a much bigger cut. Of course, that may be too dangerous a game for many defense hawk Democrats. At any rate, what becomes clear is that the spending cap is a comforting fiction intended for some budgets but not others, especially not the ones that give military contractors the purchasing power for luxury yachts and vacation homes, which makes one wonder what the point of any of this was. The Republicans spoke about changing the fiscal trajectory, but it's unlikely to change very much, and in some cases not at all. The deal only affects a fraction of federal spending, and Congress is already devising ways to shoot off the shackles they just clamped on themselves. Meanwhile, the collateral damage of this make-believe belt tightening is that a handful of interests, older poor people trying to keep eligibility for food assistance, tiny domestic policy agencies forced to do more with less, student borrowers shoved back onto the debt treadmill, will get randomly punched for no good reason. In the metaphor of Washington as a spoiled child, the debt ceiling was just a tantrum, a haphazard bout of anger, a meaningless cry for attention, but the child will remain spoiled It's playroom stuffed with toy weapons and G.I. Joe figures, no matter how much they cost. It's good to be the baby, says Dave Dayan. So, Dee, what did you think of that?
Very good. Well, I had to put the sound off because the dogs were singing and barking,
Oh, yeah.
and I couldn't hear it all. But it was very good.
Yes,
What
it
I
was.
did hear.
It was a very good analysis, wasn't it?
Yes,
Of what can happen and what the possibilities are and what the opportunities are and how foolish the whole thing was in the first place, since they were already planning more spending.
the spending is where they want it to go, and then this is what
Where they want it to go, and our job is to make them to want it to go somewhere else.
exactly.
That's what we have to do. They want it to go where the donors want it to go.
Mm-hmm. Because that's who they believe they represent. We're just there to,
Yeah, well, that
get them
is
in
who they
office, and that's about
represent.
it.
That is who they represent, I think. Well,
Mhm.
let's get on to the second very interesting article. This one is by one of our favorites, specifically Stephanie Kelton, and it is on the lens. It was done on May 30th, 2023. The headline is The Deficit Myth is Hanging On for Dear Life. She says the old playbook is making a comeback. Democrats and Republicans are closing in on a debt limit deal with the quote Fiscal Responsibility Act, the unquote, what I just called the faux Fiscal Responsibility Act. These people are very good at faux fiscal responsibility. By these people, I mean, of course, the neoliberals in both houses of Congress. Stephanie says, first came months of vowing not to negotiate with Republicans over raising the debt ceiling limit. Then came weeks of negotiating with Republicans over raising the debt ceiling limit. And now, as I've been predicting for months, it appears that Democrats and Republicans are on the verge of getting a bipartisan deal that will push pause on the debt ceiling fight until sometime in late 2024. And then, in all likelihood, we will reenact this painful drama all over again. For now, the lead negotiators on both sides are touting the deal as a win. And of course, it's been passed, as you all know. And they're still touting it on both sides as a win. Of course, on Kevin McCarthy's side, he's saying it's a loss for Democrats, but a win for the Republicans. He pretty much has to do that because uh, he's looking for rhetorical power against the Freedom Caucus. He's boasting that 95% of his caucus is, quote, overwhelmingly excited, getting back to the article, by the agreement. One exuberant member, Dusty Johnson, Republican of South Dakota, claimed that, quote, there were no wins for Democrats, unquote, in the deal that had been reached. Not so, according to President Biden and many of his fellow Democrats who are spinning the deal as, quote, good news for the American people. Well, not for old people and not for people on food stamps. And while avoiding a catastrophic default is undoubtedly, quote, good news, unquote, both for the American people and for the rest of the world, there are plenty of reasons for concern. And Stephanie then links to 4 other articles. And then she says, among other things, oh, let me get this off. claimed that the deal, let me see what I skipped over. And she says, okay, among other things, the deal would expand food stamp access for veterans and the homeless while imposing work requirements that make it harder for some Americans to qualify for the benefits they need. And although some Democratic pundits have called the work requirements trivial, quote unquote, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities describes them as, quote, harmful, unquote, pointing out that they will, quote, increase hunger and poverty, unquote, among poor older Americans. I agree with the CBPP assessment of that strongly. President Biden has claimed that the deal, quote, reduces spending while protecting critical programs for working people, but it clearly spells added hardship for some, including those who will find it difficult or impossible to satisfy the new work requirements and those who might be forced to start repaying student loan debt after being told that their debts had been approved for cancellation. If Mark Zandi is right, Mark Zandi, of course, okay, is at Moody's, the overall deal won't have a significant impact on the broader economy. He sees it as a headwind, but a small one that will only last for a couple of years. With his big salary, he can afford to say that.
Hmm.
At the peak of the macroeconomic impacts late next year, the spending cuts will lower GDP by 0.15%. That, of course, is according to the Zandi model, which is one of the most widely used models for macroeconomic forecasting. To go on with the tweet, reduce employment by 120,000 jobs and increase the unemployment rate by about zero point 0.1 percentage points. Not great given the recession risks, but um, um, it's manageable. The real risk and lasting damage will come from the destructive messaging that both sides have engaged in for the better part of 2 years. Reinforcing deficit myths. For months, Speaker McCarthy has been telling the American people that Republicans wouldn't agree to raise the debt limit without a plan to get the nation's, quote, fiscal house back in order, unquote. Never mind that he and most of his Republican colleagues voted without any preconditions to lift the debt ceiling on 3 separate occasions when Donald Trump was president. To retain his gavel, McCarthy needed to cut a deal that his members could get behind. A number of Republicans have already indicated they will break ranks and vote against the deal, and quite a number of them did. It's unclear whether McCarthy's speakership can survive a small uprising, but I suspect it won't matter in terms of passing legislation. The president wants the deal, and it looks like there will be enough support from Democrats in both the House and the Senate to carry it forward. And in the event, Stephanie Kelton was correct, as was I, as was Dave, Dayan. To sell the American people on the idea that it would be irresponsible to raise the debt ceiling without negotiating around the budget, and McCarthy invoked every deficit myth in the book. The book being the deficit myth book. I have to say, he did not invoke um, um, every myth in my book on fiscal myths of the 2016 campaign because I had something like 43 fiscal myths in there. Anyway, he took to the podium, Twitter, outdoor spaces, the hallways, and countless talk shows to complain raising the debt limit is like allowing your child to go crazy with the family credit card. He said it was, quote, common sense, unquote, that the federal government, quote, can't afford, unquote, to spend more than it takes in. He raised concerns about, quote, borrowing money from China, unquote, to, quote, pay for, unquote, social programs. And he invoked by rhetoric that the national debt is a burden on future generations by saying, quote, every new child that was born today just got a $94,000 bill. Some time ago, back, I believe, in 2012, I should look it up again in Daily Costs. Okay, I wrote a blog that said something like, but simply assuring people, we don't owe, and I cited the amount of the debt at the time, which I thought was something like 17 trillion. I said, we don't owe 17 trillion. This was in the headline. You don't owe 56,000 per family member, or something like that. And basically, in that blog, I made the case. The $94,000 bill is something the federal government owes. It doesn't have to be financed with taxation. It doesn't have to be financed with taxation on every new child born in the United States. It can be financed in many other ways. And if our future generations are smart, they won't allow it to be financed off their backs. In response, President Biden said, quote, Speaker McCarthy and I have a very different view of who should bear the burden to get our fiscal house in order. And therein lies the problem. After a brief reprieve from the deficit myth, we're backsliding into kind of dangerous rhetoric that led to the hostage negotiations in the first place. If you haven't seen it before, watch the short video below. It was put together almost a decade ago by one of my graduate students. It's worth playing. It is short.
Taking money from our children and borrowing from China.
Take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay back. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic.
The government's irresponsible spending is turning us into slaves. You might well literally lock us into chains, at least our children.
We got to deal with this big long-term debt problem, or it will deal with us.
And it is I think it is.
I'm asking you, join us to stop this fiscal train wreck. Join us to protect our children from an inferior standard of living, from a crushing burden of debt and taxes.
Okay, I don't believe in any of the tax cuts. I didn't want the tax cuts for the rich. I didn't even want it for the middle class. Okay, because you know why? Because it puts a $400 billion hole in the budget, and we just can't afford it.
And as we discuss deficit reduction, which is clearly a major issue.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future.
And the deficit thing is real, and the debt thing is real. We are really in trouble on it at some point.
Is there need for comprehensive deficit reduction? The answer is not only yes, but hell yes.
This debt that hangs over our head, a government that spends more money than it takes in. That's not sustainable.
You know, you cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you can pay for it.
The math of federal spending does not add up. And we are spending money we do not have.
A debt burden that's crushing us.
To me, this is more of a moral issue. You can't steal from your kids and grandkids.
Deficit. We think the deficit and the national debt are at a moral level.
National debt is America's biggest problem.
So, a bunch of voices from out of the past giving us the wisdom of the two wings of the neoliberal uni party.
Yes, to scare the hell out of people.
Debt terrorism.
Exactly.
Some have argued that the Biden-McCarthy deal isn't all that bad because it doesn't touch Social Security or Medicare, and it doesn't necessarily force deep cuts to non-discretionary defense spending. But ask yourself what comes next. Speaker McCarthy has called the deal, quote, an important first step in relieving America of its crushing debt. Without an effective counter-narrative, the deficit myth will return with a vengeance. So that was Stephanie's contribution. Of course, I completely agree. We, the MMT people, of which I am certainly one, have been trying to push a counter-narrative phrased in different ways for as long as I can remember, certainly since I got involved in the MMT movement early in 2009. It's been 14 years now. We have used every trick in the book to push the counter narrative. We've made some progress. Certainly, many people are now entirely aware of MMT and basically think that we are telling them the truth. But these old war horses in Washington who have been there for some time and who get elected and reelected, still hold to the neoliberal paradigm. And Thomas Kuhn, who introduced the idea of scientific paradigms to the American public back in the 1960s, said, unfortunately, quite clearly, the only way these paradigms die out is if the people who hold them die out. And I hope we don't have to go through this. Okay, I sincerely hope that we don't have to go through this in order to change things. I have to add here, in connection with Stephanie's thing, that I've thought since 2013 that in order to get rid of the neoliberals, what we had to do was to push very vigorously for the platinum coin. And I've advocated that continuously through the years. And the reason why is because $100 trillion coin, if it was minted, if the president actually decided to mint such a coin and to get the proceeds deposited into the mint's account and then swept into the Treasury General account, could then be used to gradually pay off the public debt as the debt falls due. And in doing so, could vividly demonstrate for the American people one of the central points, okay, of MMT, which is that a monetary sovereign such as the United States creates, okay, its own money without financial limits, okay, or legal limits. It has limits in terms of the effect of doing so. Inflation can be a problem. The spending that comes from it could be bad spending. There are dozens of things that could go wrong. But one thing that cannot happen, as long as you maintain your monetary sovereignty, is that there is no fiscal sustainability problem. There can be a fiscal responsibility problem, but that's based on what you spend it on and what effects come from it. It's not based on the financial capability to spend. That is just there. and the level of the debt doesn't matter at all, and the level of the debt to GDP ratio doesn't matter at all. Those are not reasons for austerity. In fact, there are no good reasons for austerity, which this debt ceiling bill introduces. For the next 2 years, they have agreed on removing the freeze of the debt ceiling, but they've also agreed on limiting discretionary spending and limiting spending by the armed services, okay, as well. And that is austerity, unless, of course, the laws change and they repudiate this particular agreement as they move forward through time. And hopefully they will do so. So, Dee, any comments on that one?
I love Stephanie Kelton and how she presented her information, and that and then also including that video that was made by one of her students, brings it to the point of refreshing people's memories, because you need that memory refreshing. Really
You
see how
need
warm
that
it's been.
memory that they were delivering the same kind of BS back in 2011, 2012, and 2013. And guess what? The country hasn't collapsed from the increased debt. In fact, it spent even more and more when it had to spend huge amounts on the COVID crisis. There was no trouble spending huge amounts on the COVID crisis. And we're no nearer to fiscal bankruptcy now than we were in 2011, 2012, and 2013. Okay, even though the size of the national debt is almost twice as much.
When they were talking about paying out, how they pay out the interest on the debt, they said coming from your grandchildren, your future generations. I'm thinking, are they talking about their trust fund accounts, whatever?
No, they're not really talking about anything. Okay, in
I
other
know, I'm
words,
talking about for their kids. You know how they have the rich people may have the trust funds for their kids, and putting money in the trust
right,
funds for the kids.
but they're
Are
not
they going
talking
to have less
about
money
that.
to put in them? Oh, I know, because I'm trying to think, what the hell are they talking about?
What they're talking about is they're looking at the size of the debt, and they are dividing by the number of people in this country. And when you divide 300, the total debt, $31.4 trillion, and you divide that by 330 million some odd people, you get $94,000 per person. So the implication is that that debt will have to be paid back by taxation.
That's crazy.
And that we somehow owe the debt which the government decided to incur when at any time, okay, I won't say that it could have used the platinum coin, okay, at any time, because the platinum coin wasn't really thought of until 2009. But overt congressional financing was there for them all the time. All you had to do was add 2 sentences to every appropriation bill to order the Federal Reserve to put the money needed to spend the appropriation in the Treasury spending account, and to put the money needed to pay back all debt and interest falling due in the fiscal year of the appropriation. That's all that Congress had to do to ensure that all the debt that had been incurred would have been paid off, and furthermore, that there would be no need to issue any future debt instruments. Right. That could have been done by any Congress, okay, at any time. I mean, it's the addition of two sentences. Okay, I could pull up the graphic showing those two sentences right now, but I won't because we have to get on to some other articles, which are very important and which I want to cover today. However, believe me, any Congress at any time from 1789 on could have developed a procedure where congressional appropriations were accompanied by an order to the Central Bank of the United States to create reserves in the Treasury spending account to be used to spend that appropriation. So all those Congresses didn't want to do that. Instead, what they did was to create the capacity for taxation and the capacity for borrowing. But that was a choice of Congress itself. It was a political choice. And whether or not people are going to have to pay back the $94,000 is also a political choice. And people have to be wise enough to say, no, you're not going to choose that. We're not going to pay back that debt. The government, with its powers to create money, its unlimited powers to create money, is going to pay back that debt. Not me. It ain't my debt. I didn't vote to create it. That's what people have to remember. Anyway, Dee, should we go on or you have more to add?
I think we should go on, but we have to, constantly bring up this stuff, I think, because of, it's just they're consistently using these talking points to make people feel that, the sky's falling when it's not.
Yeah, right. And I guess I have to say at this point, I have to remind everybody again that in 2015, I wrote a book called Fiscal Myths of the 2016 Campaign. Those fiscal myths were not only good for that campaign, but for the 2020 campaign good as well. And that book is available on Amazon as a Kindle book. It costs $9.99. It isn't as well written as Stephanie's book. In some ways, it's not as simple, Stephanie's book, but it does give you, it is pretty readable, and it does give you myth after myth after myth after myth after myth, almost anything they can think of. And it gives you a rebuttal to any of those myths as well. It's kind of like a little encyclopedia of the fiscal myth bullshit that they're going to come up with and what the counter talking points are. So that might be very useful for some of you in the coming political battles over the debt and the deficit, which the neoliberals seem to have brought back.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get to happier matters. There was a column by Robert C. Hockett, who's a university professor of law at the Cornell Law School. And he has a column for Forbes as well. We've occasionally gone over some of his stuff here because he's one of my favorite writers. He also knows MMT quite well. And the article is entitled, and I don't think I'm sharing it quite yet, so let me get it. The article is entitled, "What is the New Economic Patriotism?" Hint, it's about the production. The reason why I thought this was important is if neoliberalism is coming back, We need to counter it with an ideology that's new and fresh, okay, and effective. And that ideology may be what Robert Hockett is calling the new economic patriotism. And so let us go through the article and see what it's about. There's a picture of George Washington in consultation with his Secretary of the Treasury, who is Alexander Hamilton, of course.
Mhm.
It has taken a long while and a great deal of adversity, but Americans of many political persuasions, Democrat and Republican, progressive and conservative, partisan and independent, are at last rediscovering something we'd come close to forgetting. I refer to the existential importance of our nation's productive capabilities in a world of transnational peril as the indispensable basis of our national security, our social stability, and hence our persistence as a polity alike, and as a base that's been steadily undermined by decades of misguided, quote, free trade, unquote, and, quote, financialization, unquote. Our role as a workshop of the world, quote, unquote, is a role we should never have relinquished. Of course, we relinquished it to the Chinese and other places, and must now restore, and we must do so as quickly as possible. I have long agreed with this sentiment and have been a critic, a serious critic for a long time, of sending the industries we had here to other nations. It was one of the most scurrilous things that the neoliberal Republicans and Democrats did over the years since the Carter administration, actually providing tax incentives to people who would move to other countries, as if the lower cost of labor was not enough of an incentive. The government also provided tax incentives for corporations to do that. Jeez. Two American statespersons have stood out far more than most others in designing and articulating what I'll call the new operating system, quote unquote, of this recovery. The operating system of a new economic patriotism, quote, NEP. I guess I have to put in a historical note there. No, I guess I'm not going to put in this historic note because someone might get the wrong impression. They can dig up the historical note themselves. They are Democratic Representative Ro Khanna of Silicon Valley and Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. I'll resist the obvious remark to make in response to the evocation of Marco Rubio, Florida. Although I have done work for both legislators, CEG here, and here, and he links to 3 posts of his. It is Representative Khanna with whom I've worked most closely of late. It is also Ro Khanna who has been most consistently out front of the NEP. So my elaboration of the vision in question will probably resemble his just a little more closely than Senator Rubio's. Nevertheless, I believe much I shall say here will be approved by both statespersons I might have something to quarrel with in referring to both of them as statespersons, especially with respect to one of them. So, what is this NEP, quote unquote? What does the vision entail? First thing to note is the choice of the word patriotism, which Representative Connor takes great care to distinguish from, quote, nationalism, unquote. The latter term nowadays carries regrettably negative, or at any rate, quote, zero-sum connotations. Not simply today, that term has carried those connotations from way back in the 1920s and 1930s until today, and the distinction between nationalism and patriotism has been made here in the United States continuously all through that time. It suggests that attending to our own productive development might entail disfavor of other nations' productive development, that all is a dog-eat-dog war among nations for market share. That in turn further suggests suspicion of immigrants, which nearly all Americans either are or are descended from. Such tendencies are, of course, not what Representative Khanna seeks or endorses, quite the contrary. Rather, the NIP version is of a world in which all nations or groupings of nations with rich endowments of human creativity and natural resources can build long-term, sustainable, broadly inclusive, and hence well-diversified economies. We seek a world, in other words, in which all large groupings of people, be these single nations or collaborative groupings of smaller nations, enjoy rich agricultural, manufacturing, commercial, and financial capacities. Literally all of the above to such a degree that cross-border trade for each and all never will be a necessity, but ever will be an option. Now, that's an important statement, because the reference to financial capacities refers to monetary sovereignty. There are a number of monetarily sovereign nations in this world: the United States, Canada, the UK, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. Lots of nations come to mind in this particular category. And they have capacities to deficit spend in order to counter business cycles or to make investments that are important to them. But there are a whole bunch of other nations, particularly the Eurozone nations, also the developing nations, which for one reason or another are not monetarily sovereign right now. And that restricts their capabilities to get out of the development box that they are in. It hampers them in relation to creating prosperity for their populations. And so implicitly, what Robert is saying here is he sees a vision where all nations are monetarily sovereign. But he also speaks to much more than that. They're agriculturally sovereign,
Yeah,
food
yeah.
sovereignty.
No.
Sorry, D.
Oh, I was talking to Colby. I wasn't sure if he wanted to go out, but no, he didn't want to. He just wanted to hop on the bed with me here.
Oh, okay. So
I thought I had the mute thing on.
okay, so he wants for all nations to have the agricultural, manufacturing, commercial, and financial capacities to make them truly sovereign, okay, and independent. And that's what's implied in to such a degree that cross-border trade for each and all never will be a necessity, but ever will be an option. And then dependency, in our view, breeds breeds mutual resentment and war among global winners and losers. Not to say social strife among domestic winners um, and losers. A few years back, again in 2015, I wrote a couple of books about this. One was called Declarations of Dependence, and it was about how dependence can bring tyranny. And it was about the trade deals which the United States and some of its allies were trying to impose on the rest of the world at that time. It went through the 3 trade deals that were current at that time and outlined the ways in which they limited the sovereignty, okay, of nations. You can find that book, okay, at Amazon. It costs $9.99. Some of the details of it, of course, are dated now because it was written in the middle of a crisis where the Democratic administration was trying to pass these 3 monumental trade deals that would have compromised our monetary sovereignty and the sovereignty of lots of other nations as well. They were terrible trade deals. The Trump administration was better at trade deals than the Obama administration was. They at least try to avoid the investor-state dispute settlement aspects of the trade deals. But getting back to books in 2015, that was one book I wrote on the connection between dependency, okay, and tyranny. Then another book I wrote in the same year was about the effects of austerity policy forced upon the nation of Greece by the EU Troika, forcing Greece into a crippling austerity that lasted for years, that they are not still free from. Actually, more than a decade later, basically the EU imposed an economic tyranny on Greece back in, if I recall correctly, 2013. And that book is about the imposition of that tyranny, okay, on Greece. I'm sorry, it wasn't in 2013 that the imposition occurred. It was finalized in 2015. And that book is largely about a panel discussion that occurred here, okay, in DC. And the panel discussion was sponsored by Bernie Sanders. And the person who organized it was Stephanie Kelton. She was then serving as the chief economist for the budget committee that Bernie Sanders was the chair of, okay, in the Senate. And the panel involved Stephanie, of course, herself, and Jamie Galbraith, Joe Stiglitz, and Jacob Kierkegaard, who was a conservative and basically a defender of the EU position, okay, and all that. But that was quite a discussion, and I gave an extended discussion in that book of that particular discussion in the context of the politics of the moment and the collapse of the Syriza party, they're caving in to the European powers that be. It's a very interesting book, and it also talks about possible ways. Well, it talks about the ways in which the Europeans had Greece trapped through information technology controls over their currency that had been introduced when they joined the EU. And basically, the book also talked about how certain information technology techniques could be used to free the Greeks from that if they wanted to get out of the EU and use their own currency again, which would have allowed them to escape the austerity policies that were forced on them, okay, at that time. Anyway, that's a little long a story that I had to tell about that. But going on with what Bob Hockett had to say, he was talking about the global winners and losers, not to say social strife among domestic winners, okay, and losers. And then he continues, and that is to be studiously avoided by all. A strategy in which, quote, winning need not entail losing, quote unquote, in our view, is a strategy that all patriots everywhere, all who take sober pride in their peoples, their cultures, their histories, and their futures, can sign on to at no cost to and with no disrespect or humiliation of others. How might we do this? What does the NEP strategy look like in practice? Well, after patriotism, the next word to fix on above is, quote, diversify, quote unquote. Here I refer not to demographics, important though that be, but to production. I refer to the manifold means of both material and spiritual wealth generation. The new economic patriotism rests fundamentally in what I call by turns, quote, the production agenda, unquote, or, quote, the new patriotism. Sorry, I mistakenly clicked on something. And by that, I mean continuous policy attention to all that's required to enable a nation, a people, to fulfill every person's full human potential. This potential being that of a uniquely creative, uniquely productive presence on the earth and in time in the cosmos, is a sacred trust of which all of us are the joint custodians. We cannot squander anyone without immeasurable loss to humanity. This is no mere obsession or idiosyncratic concern. It's at the heart, in one way or another, of most economic and social philosophies, not to say religions and spiritual traditions throughout human history. And it's at the heart of America's history itself, including our history as our own people, our own nation, since having ceased being a jumble of seaboard colonies. A few Americans seem to talk any longer about how it was this very vision that drove our original 13 colonies to declare independence from Great Britain in the first place, but that's how it was. It was our full recognition of our sacred right to be our own producers and our experience of our colonial overlords' contempt for that right, which set off what was then called our, quote, glorious cause, our revolution. While, quote, taxation without representation, unquote, was, of course, part of this story, we forget the much larger story of which it was only one part. For the thing to recall her is not as much that there was taxing as what was being taxed. What was being taxed was, in a phrase, quote, finished goods, unquote, i.e., manufactures from Britain. These were goods that Americans easily could have produced tax-free. Indeed, likely could have produced better and cheaper than could British manufacturers, but which Britain was prohibiting us from producing. Britain's policy, you see, was to keep America in a permanently subservient colonial status, the status of mere suppliers of, quote, unfinished inputs to British producers. We were to chop wood, trap the beavers, and grow crops to send back across the Atlantic while leaving the spinning, the weaving, the shipbuilding, the ironworking, and so forth to London, then to Liverpool, then to Glasgow and Manchester. This is what being, quote, what being a, quote, colony, unquote, means after all. It means specializing in but one thing or productive for purposes determined by somebody else, the colonial ruler. The alternative, which Americans demanded peacefully for decades until it grew clear only war would actually deliver, was productive equality, productive autonomy. That is, a productive economy as diverse as our natures and nature allowed. This, of course, is why our first president, George Washington, famously wore, quote, homespun, that is, American-made clothing at his first inauguration. He was, quote, was modeling, unquote, a message, namely that America's aim to achieve full productive autonomy had at last been achieved. We were our own people now, before we were our own producers now. We depended on no one for anything, so that trade would henceforth be a matter of choice, not but necessity, an option or luxury, not a form of dependency. This original wellspring of our revolution also explains, of course, all of our first Treasury Secretaries, Alexander Hamilton's celebrated policies while in office. Hamilton effectively erected from scratch, with the full blessing, encouragement, and assistance of President Washington and most of the new Congress, the foundation of that great American economic miracle, quote unquote, of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the miracle that made the 20th century, quote, the American century. He established a national monetary system, a system of public finance, and both our first industrial research park and our first national infrastructure bank to jumpstart a domestic productive capacity. He also pushed tariffs on imported finished goods. Until then, still infant American industries could compete on their own. As Hamilton did this, American manufacturing sprouted, then flourished and spread. And this in turn fostered remarkably rapid agricultural, commercial, and financial developments as complements to our manufacturing industries. Hence, a fully diversified and autonomous national economy that quickly became the model for the world. So successful was the program of Washington, Hamilton, and their followers, their vision acquired a telling name, quote, the American system, unquote, of deliberate national development. Soon, an insightful German-American economist named Friedrich List generalized this into what he dubbed, quote, the national system, unquote, of national economic development. A deliberate adoption of the Hamilton-List system quickly brought first the German economic miracle of the late 19th century, then the Meiji Japanese and Romanov Russian economic miracles of the early 20th century, and then the quote Asian, unquote, and quote Celtic, unquote, quote tiger miracles, unquote, of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. This, of course, and this is, of course, what we're seeing in China right now. In effect, what might be called, quote, Hamiltonian development with Chinese characteristics. What about China, then, now that I've mentioned it? Is Ro Khanna's new economic patriotism somehow, quote, anti-China, unquote? Well, it certainly needn't be, says Bob Hockett. There are two things to note here to understand why. First, the U.S. relation to China has grown surprisingly reminiscent of our pre-19th century relation to Great Britain. We supply unfinished goods, mainly agricultural products and other products of the earth, such as minerals and wood, while China supplies the manufactured goods. This asymmetry is moreover like that with Britain before, the product of deliberate policy choices, in this case, clever choices by China and improvident choices by American business and political leaders. But the second thing to note here is that there's no necessary juridical basis for the imbalance this time. We are not charted as or otherwise legally constituted to be colonies of China or anyone else. Hence, we needn't, quote, rebel, unquote, to make war to reestablish our productive autonomy. We need only rediscover and redeploy our own homegrown Hamiltonian development policy domestically while re-examining our trading relations abroad, all with the aim of restoring our fully productively diverse, hence independent national economy. This is precisely why Representative Khanna never talks jingoistically about China or any other country, and why he regularly emphasizes that a restored mutual autonomy and new mutual respect between America and China will be good for both countries. Both countries, after all, are capable of being manufacturing superpowers, as are Europe, India, and many groupings of other smaller countries. Why not let all of these flowers bloom? Why play as if we could? Why play as if all we could manage were, quote, winner take all, unquote? Of course, rebalancing our trade relations with other peoples is but one building block of the new productivism and the new economic patriotism, even as crucial as that is. For pride in our country entails pride in our people as well. Pride in their potentials, pride in their God-given human ingenuity and miraculous creative powers, and any such pride will be manifest in policy. Policy that assures free or affordable education to all, free or affordable medical access to all, easily affordable shelter and foodstuffs and job and retirement security for all. Now, I notice he said free or affordable. um, free or affordable medical access to all, rather than saying Medicare for all. He didn't want to explicitly declare that he has questions about the utility of the Affordable Care Act, which is implied by his free or affordable, but he didn't want to explicitly come out against the Affordable Care Act. Going further, you could not be patriotic about your country, your patria, without being patriotic about your fellows, your compatriots as well. And it is perhaps this fact above all that distinguishes the new economic patriotism and the new productivism from mere chest-beating nationalism or jingoism. And here, I have to mention specifically Donald Trump, because Trump and those who think like him say they are proud of America and say they are patriots, but they are not proud of all of us. They are not proud of their compatriots. They are constantly dividing Americans into groups. They are, in other words, being unpatriotic about their fellows and claiming that only some of their fellows are entitled to a shot at the bounty of America. So let's keep that one clear, and let's note it is this vision, not mere compatibility with, but its weddedness to, it's in effect being one side of the same coin with social and economic justice. For no nation of peasants or serfs working a few oligarchs' farms or factories has ever been a productive superpower rather than a mere banana republic, the latter so named thanks to dependence upon a few landowning families' agricultural produce. All such past superpowers, including our own, have been built by the huge middle classes, what our founders called sturdy yeomen, quote unquote, made possible by an abundance of public goods, from publicly assured education through infrastructure to homesteads and health care and child care. Let us then turn to the task. Let us reclaim our productive autonomy and manufacturing superpower status without denigrating any other people's and without exploiting our own people, mistakes that in fact undermine the productive mission. Let's build ourselves, our compatriots, and with them all humanity back to its proper place in this world and this cosmos, the place of the producers. That, in the end, is the new productivism and hence the new economic patriotism, a program affirmable by all, from Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders to Marco Rubio, and from Mike Gallagher to Pramila Jayapal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ro Khanna. That's how Bob ends this. Okay. I need to add something important to it. First, Bob emphasizes the new productivism and the importance of producing our own goods again, the goods that we need to live, okay, and to prosper here. And not to rely on global dependencies. He explicitly rejects the global dependencies of the globalists. He is not a globalist. He is someone who respects the sovereignty of all nations and is interested in having nations work together. What I have to add to his treatment, okay, is this: the vision of the new economic patriotism needs to include the idea of the public purpose as it was first introduced by Kenneth Galbraith, first in the 1970s and developed somewhat later. The goal, okay, of our economic patriotism, the overall goal should be the public purpose. The public purpose is to be decided upon democratically by the people, okay, of each nation. In seeking the public purpose, the idea of the new economic patriotism can serve them, because what do they produce for? What is their productive capacity to serve? It is to serve the public purpose in their particular nation. Now, some time ago, again in 2015, I wrote a whole bunch of books quickly in 2017. And what I wrote then, okay, in those years, all the books I wrote in 2015 and the beginning of 2016 were books that made use of the MMT framework. And I wrote one other book I've mentioned here before: Who Needs Balanced Trade? Who Needs Balanced Budgets? That's available at Amazon too. It also costs $9.99. I priced all the books at that particular price. What that book actually focuses on is the importance of the idea of the public purpose and the importance of integrating both fiscal policy and foreign policy, including foreign trade policy, around the idea of the public purpose. So for me, the new economic patriotism also needs to be linked up to the idea of fulfilling the public purpose. In Bob's vision, okay, of the NEP, he sees all nations subscribing to the NEP, creating various kinds of sovereignty for themselves. And I see that also. And I see that in doing that, the purpose of all nations, all the individual nations, would be to achieve their own public purposes. How are the public purposes of the different nations to be harmonized? How are any possible conflicts to be resolved? Well, they need to be resolved through the idea of respecting the human rights of the people, of all the nations, and their entitlement to define their own ideas, of public purpose, and their own interpretations of the new economic patriotism, of what it entails. Because of the very potential of conflict, among the nations, conscious thinking about what the public purpose is to be and what the new economic patriotism is to entail will be worked out, among the nations through diplomatic efforts and through peaceful exchanges. Bob's vision is implicitly a vision of collaboration and cooperation among ourselves and all the other nations that we deal with. You notice Bob emphasizes that our relations with China need not be conflictful. They need not be at anybody's expense. They need not be at China's expense. They can be peaceful because if China is developing itself as best it can, which apparently is what its leadership class is devoted to, and apparently what its leadership class has been doing now for some very long period of time. If we do the same thing here, that's what our business ought to be. It shouldn't be trying to take them down or impede their development and their progress, nor should we try to do that with any other nation. In each case, we want to collaborate with other nations so that in our relations with them, we make good deals, win-win deals for them and for us that enhance their potential and their capacities as well as our potential, and our capacities. And I wanted to leave you with that lesson, but I also wanted to show you one more thing, which is very current and which cannot be forgotten when we are talking about the new economic patriotism. What I'm sharing now is a piece from Common Dreams. It's by Bill McKibben, and the photo, of course, is what the New York City skyline looked like on June 7th, and what it also looks like still today, I believe. Through the smoky haze, can we see clearly now the climate emergency? And that's by Bill McKibben. He says, today is our chance to understand what it really feels like every day on a fossil-fueled planet for the billions of people unlucky enough to really bear the brunt. My eyes are stinging a bit from the smoke, but I've never seen more clearly. Bill says, I live in Vermont, where the scent of wood smoke on a late fall afternoon is an iconic smell. It was not like that here. Wednesday, it was more like sitting on the side of the campfire where the wind is blowing, but without any benefits of the blaze. The air was dull gray, and the sunshine through it looked and felt diminished, as if from a different star circling a different planet. My chest was tight, and I kept bringing up the phlegm. And I'm lucky. The air was worse in New York and in D.C. Indeed, across the East, cities are breaking all-time pollution records. I imagine it was smokier back in the early industrial revolution, but we weren't but measuring it. And we're all lucky because this is what a huge percentage of the world's people breathe every single day of their lives. In fact, we should probably in our hearts, if not our lungs, be grateful for a few days like this. They bring us much closer to the lived experience of billions of our brothers and sisters. I want to leave it there for this article, but I want to connect it up to the new economic patriotism, okay, as well. The new economic patriotism and the public purpose must, of course, include the idea of turning to meet the climate emergency as quickly as possible, because the events of yesterday and today and the days going forward, when that air spreads to the south, okay, and to the west, should bring home to everybody that the climate emergency is here to stay unless we handle it. It has to be a part of the new economic patriotism, and it has to be a major element in the concepts of public purpose that we develop for ourselves and that other nations develop for themselves. And that's what I have to say tonight. Dee, I turn to you for comments.
I like the final line. We determine for ourselves, but let other people determine for themselves.
Yes. Pretty critical.
Yes, because we have this habit of telling people what they should do, and if they don't do it, we're going to bring you democracy through bombs.
Yes.
We're going to destroy your country.
And democracy at the point of a gun.
Yes.
Or democracy at the point of economic sanctions.
Yeah.
Or imperialistic extraction. Yes.
And the good news is that those days are going to be gone, looks like.
We hope. We hope they'll be gone very soon. We need a transformation of the world over the next 3 or 4 years that really puts an end to this nonsense.
Right, and then the term civilized, it always gets to me when it's more barbaric the way we've been acting, and then they try to say, oh, colonialism, civilization, and it's a bit hypocritical.
It is highly hypocritical and it's intolerable besides. So Steve Wolfbrand says hello. Robert Copeland says, I think things could be worse in 2025 when it comes to the debt ceiling. They could be worse, but they could also be better. If we work hard and we get that Dump the Corruption campaign going, and if we work hard and we get MMT framework much more widely accepted, and if we work hard and develop a great conception of the public purpose, we can have decision makers in 2025 who will, in facing a debt ceiling crisis, if they do face such a crisis, will just resolve it by using the 14th Amendment or issuing consoles, okay, or issuing the $100 trillion platinum coin. We can have that happen in 2025 just as easily as we could have another crippling debt ceiling crisis. It's up to us to get organized and to make happen what we want to happen. Wesley Weil says, Joe, I really feel like eugenics is making a resurgence, not just in rhetoric, but in formal policy. This is where laissez-faire eugenics from the Hoover era in the Mount Pelerin Society is neoliberal. Yeah, the Mount Pelerin Society was, of course, the genesis of neoliberalism in this country during the 1940s. For those of you who don't recognize it, the Mount Pelerin Society's neoliberal project becomes the clear fundamental logic when both sides allow the framework slash rhetoric around the national debt, weighing the spending on social welfare costs being larger than other places. Fiscal income and debt flows is what Nazi Germany did. They used graphs showing the welfare costs on bonds outweighing other national spending. Then they passed eugenic sterilization laws on the old and the handicapped. Yes, they did, but Wesley, the perspectives of MMT will stop that because the welfare costs, whatever they are easily affordable for a monetary sovereign country. We must educate the populace on the basics of MMT. That is one defense against the attempts of the fascists and the Nazis to take over our political system. I won't say to take over our democracy, because our democracy has already been taken over by the oligarchs. And this is what's been giving the space to the Nazis and the fascists to operate. The first thing we have to do is to get rid of the oligarchs. And the first thing we have to do to get rid of the oligarchs is to get rid of the bought people in Congress who are taking their money. Every last one of them in Congress and the executive branch who were taking their money. Of course, Nazis got all that rhetoric and legal context from the US, who had sterilization laws on the books for decades, yes. Jeff Denton leaves an icon that I can't see here from this interface. Laz says, I will see Stephanie next week. Can't wait. Are you going to a conference that Stephanie will be at, Lana? It's a lie that Fed debt is our personal debt. Totally backwards, yes, as I wrote in my blogs on that subject. Wesley Wiles says, I put a clip from a prof talking at Michigan U in this vid. Twitter replies about the rhetoric around eugenics and using national debt to scare people in the worst impulses during that period of history. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Lana. Hello, shared. And Sandy Degas here too. Hello, Sandy. Nice to see you. Sandy shared. It's been bad here in New Jersey. It's been bad here in DC too. We were code red and orange. It got a little less hazy and stinky. Sandy says, looking forward to the rain. Ghostart says, hey, Joe. Hand purple, blue, peace face, blue, smiling, hand pink waving. What's your reply to the doomsday of the dollar due to BRICS, people? There isn't going to be any doomsday for the dollar. It just won't be the only reserve currency of the world. It will still be a very important currency because we are a very large nation and have an economy that is very large and that is transacting in the dollar. But while I say that, I also have to recognize that two more moves in the last few days. First of all, it's clear that Lula is strongly allying Brazil with BRICS. Secondly, there was an announcement by AMLO that he is interested in joining BRICS. Our nearest neighbor, specifically Mexico, if they join BRICS, will begin to use the BRICS currency that is slated to be formulated through the rest of this year. Mexico will be engaging with the new development bank and not so much any longer with the World Bank or with the IMF. That will be happening to our closest neighbor. Why would it be happening? Because over the years, when you really look at it, we haven't been that friendly to Mexico. The NAFTA treaty was devastating for the people, of Mexico. It ruined the basis of small agriculture and small farms, in Mexico. It had grave effects on that country, which is one reason why so many Mexicans have migrated here. But in addition to AMLO's move, the Saudis have now gotten closer. They are joining BRICS first as an observer, and they're projected soon to become a full participant, in BRICS. But they apparently will be the first of the new joiners of BRICS these few weeks in June. A lot more nations than just Saudi are expected to join BRICS. But it's very significant that Saudi made this move now. It's very significant that AMLO has announced that he will be embracing BRICS very soon. We will still be very important. We're very important to Canada. We'll probably still be very important to Mexico because there's a lot of trading to do with them. We will continue to be very important to China because they still want to sell into our markets. We, of course, are very important to Australia, and to New Zealand, and to Canada. But we are going to have to be collaborative. We are going to have to get rid of the sanctions. We're going to have to respect the sovereignty, of other nations.
And that's the big problem the USA has.
Yes. We have to replace our foreign policy team because personnel is policy, and these neoliberal types cannot be running our foreign policy anymore. All they bring is conflict, struggles over hegemony, and wars. And if we continue playing those games, we will be the losers, not the winners, because the whole rest of the world will be against us. We have to remember there are 8.5 billion people in this world. We have only 330 million of them. It's a ground fact. We cannot dominate the world any longer. The split up of the Soviet Union was a freak. It was a freak occurrence. It left us as the hegemon of the world. That was not good for our nation, because there was nothing pressuring us to make use of the opportunity to work with other nations. And so our main method of dealing with them became coercion, either economic, or military. And that's why we're in the trouble we are in today, when every other nation is turning their face away from us and towards the BRICS coalition.
Yes, and we have to get over this white supremacy bullshit.
We do. Sandy says, what do you think of Cornel West running for president? I'm a political scientist. I think the ability to work with and within bureaucracies is very important before a president. I think Cornel West would be a very inspirational president, but I also think he neither has the experience nor the disposition to deal with Congress and to deal with the bureaucracy. That said, I like the idea that he is running for president, because he will present very broad visions for the country to contemplate. He will present us with ideas that we should aspire to. I've given you the vision of a new patriotism tonight, embellished with the public purpose. I'm sure Cornel West will have a deeper and broader vision than those ideas. And he will offer that during his campaign. And that can only be good to get people talking about that. I also think that he will be echoed, certainly by Marianne Williamson, and in some creative ways, probably by Robert F. Kennedy. As Joe Biden continues to slip, and the projections by me are that he will continue to slip, because he's gotten himself in a big pickle now. He got himself in a big pickle when he didn't do well enough in his first 2 years and he gave the Republicans back the House. He didn't do well enough. He probably could have avoided giving the Republicans the House just with doing one thing, but certainly two things. First, seeing to it that the $15 an hour minimum wage got through Congress. He could have done that. He could have done that. There were 8 people who voted against that. The only ones on the Democratic side who voted against that, the only ones who were not in his pocket, were Manchin and Sinema. And he could have gotten their votes too, through horse trades of various kinds, if he had wanted $15 an hour through. The idea of, I respect the parliamentarian, people who are working for $7 an hour today, and $9 an hour today, and $10 an hour today. What do you think they think of that? I mean, that was BS. He has blown the chance, furthermore, to eliminate student debt. He used the wrong justification and the wrong approach because he was worried about moral hazard. And then finally, two things. He allows the child tax credit to not be renewed. And then, furthermore, he makes this debt ceiling deal that, if it's observed by people as it's envisioned right now, will condemn us to 2 more years of no progress on the climate. 2 years that we cannot afford. Joe Biden has been a miserable failure as President of the United States, from my standpoint. And I think that Cornel West and Robert Kennedy and Marianne Williamson are the ones who stand to benefit from Joe Biden's failure, because eventually his numbers will fall below any reasonable point for even contemplating that he can be reelected as president. Then the rats will begin to desert the sinking ship, and the Democrats will turn to somebody else. It's interesting to speculate who they might turn to as the establishment candidate to impose the insurgents, RFKJ, Cornel West, and Marianne Williamson. It promises to be yet a very interesting campaign. We will see if the DNC can hold the line for establishment candidates. And if not, we will then see whether third parties can break the two-party domination of our political system. And in the middle of all this will be our movement to dump the corruption, which I hope you all will support and will all spread around, because we got to get going with dump the corruption. It's got to have millions of adherents by the time 2024 rolls around. And remember, if you don't get those people taking the money out of Congress in 2024, there will be no Medicare for all. There will be no dealing with the climate emergency. There will be no student debt elimination. There will be no reform of the Supreme Court.
More people will die.
And there will be continued domination of the political system by the oligarchs. There is no alternative to dump the corruption. Start working for it. Lana says, yes, Harvard Law School event Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Also Rowan, Nathan T., Sarah Bloom, Raskin, Raul Carrillo, Steve Keen, etc. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. I wish people would stop losing their crap over this reserve currency status fear porn. Yes, so do I. It is not that important. When we need to deal in the other currencies, we'll be able to get them on the currency trading market. There won't be the problem, because every indication is that the new currency will not be used to politically sanction other nations, not even us. I would not even be surprised if one of the market basket of currencies that are defined by the BRICS nations doesn't include as one of the currencies the dollar itself. Of course, if we keep on running this lousy foreign policy we're running, we might just do ourselves out of the possibility of that happening. IKR, how do you quickly reply to them in a chat? And Lana smiles. Lana says, a lot of gringos are moving to Mexico. I follow 2 chats on this. Yes, a lot of them are, but okay, if we look at immigration, okay, I don't think there is more immigration here from Mexico, okay, at this point, than we are losing to other places. I don't think there's a net gain of people anymore. I might be wrong about that, but I think it's getting pretty close. Ghostot says, Marianne, Kyle, and Crystal aren't too thrilled with, I guess it's with Cornell's Row. Yeah, I'll bet they aren't too thrilled. But I also bet they're not going to start attacking Cornell.
That would be completely ridiculous.
That would be completely ridiculous. Barney says stupid.
Exactly.
Okay. PSA, Trump's been indicted. He's been indicted Tuesday?
Yeah, that came across to my screen that he's been indicted. But you know something? Donald Trump, as we said, with the marketing that he does, he's the product and he somehow knows how to get the people with
Well,
him no matter what.
I think it's significant that he's been indicted, but who indicted him at what level? Was it Merrick Garland? Okay, details of that. I haven't seen anything on the Trump indictment. I don't know how I missed that because I have been watching the news over the last 2 days. So I wonder who did indict him and at what level that was. That's very significant. Can you say approximately how many states will allow an electoral college vote time only D or R? Scott D has told me New York has such a rule. Lisa has also brought it up, so I believe safe to say Pennsylvania. No, I don't. I'm not sure that's true for Pennsylvania. I think Pennsylvania has a rule that in the primaries, I think it has closed primaries. Okay, Lisa knows though. I'll be talking to her soon. So I'll ask her what she thinks about that. Certainly in 2016, Jill Stein had ballot access in Pennsylvania for the Green Party. Ghostot says Joe Daddy just vetoed a student loan forgiveness bill. He did? He did? There wasn't a student loan forgiveness bill that got through the House. Are you saying Okay, I don't know what that means, Steve Gostard. Wesley Weil says Saudi is USD neutral. USD is already underpinning the structure, and not just the global USD price indexing. They are trading with the dollarization is about the currency they saved in, not the currency they trade in. That's been true so far, but if they're joining the BRICS, they're going to have to save in BRICS currency too, so that they can trade in that currency. Gostard says he was ordered to appear on Tuesday. Gostard by whom? At what level? Who indicted him? Please. They're all dollarized except China. All dollarized except Russia. China increased USD holdings as U.S. imports drove the last few quarters of growth in China. U.S. online spending can sway China growth by about 5 to 10% up or down. Interesting. Lisa specifically said that third parties get squashed when they go to vote for the Electoral College. She wasn't talking about the primary, but I hope you will ask her to elaborate. I will. Sandy says student debt forgiveness got shut down. At what level, Sandy? Did it get shot down in the House? Did it get shot down, in the Senate? I'm sure no student debt forgiveness bill passed the Congress. Tuesday at 3 p.m. ET to see what the exact charges are. Tuesday at 3 p.m. ET, where? Go start. Okay, I'll Google it. I'll find out what's going on. Okay, it's 11:15 p.m. Been here for 2 hours and 15 minutes. I think it's time to say goodnight. Thank you for all the discussion. Thank you for coming. And thank you for staying around.
And if you haven't already, please hit the like button and subscribe and share. But I'm sure everybody here has done that.
And please buy Dia coffee.
Yes, buy Joe a coffee.
And please buy me a coffee and or visit my Patreon account. Gostard said Joe Biden shot down student loan forgiveness. Oh, you mean he made a statement saying that there wasn't going to be any more student loan forgiveness? Well, we'll see about that, because there's going to be an awful lot of pressure when the repayments start and there's chaos in the economy. We'll see whether he sticks with that.
Oh, somebody taking my stuff.
Oh, look at.
Did she?
Yeah, she was running around with it. She ran around with
And
it.
Lana says, have court tomorrow with my son. Please send good vibes. Okay, Lana?
Yes, we will.
Here are some good vibes. Hope the court is understanding. Sandy says former President Donald Trump has been indicted for a second time. Sources tell. This time on federal charges in relation to his handling of classified information while out of office. Sources familiar confirmed to ABC News. The former president faces at least 7 charges, sources tell ABC News, which include willful retention of national defense information, conspiracy to obstruct justice, withholding a document or record, corrupting, concealing a document or record, concealing a document in a federal INVE, Kostat says, sorry, Joe. It was DOJ, I think. So that was Sandy who wrote that at 11:16. So thanks, everybody. As I say again, time to say good night.
Yes, then
See
we'll
you
see
tomorrow
everyone
night.
tomorrow.
See you tomorrow night with another Dump the Corruption show.
And I will see you tomorrow. And what happened?
Okay, and thank you, Dee, for being here.
Yes, and I'm on my D Pierce channel. So if you want to just subscribe to that channel, D Pierce, on YouTube.
Okay, but isn't that around the world with Dee and friends?
Actually, that channel I can't use for 7 days, so I'm using my other account, D Pierce.
Okay. Oh, so that's your YouTube account, or is that
Yes.
your Buy Me a Coffee account?
Well, actually, my Buy Me a Coffee is D Pierce as well, D Pierce.
Okay.
And the channel that I'm using right now, I had the show on tonight, was on D Pierce channel. On YouTube. The YouTube was D Pierce. So I have to use that. Well, I've been kind of recently sharing some of the shows over to my other channel, but I really haven't been on it much. But now that I can't use the other for 7 days, I have to use this one.
You aren't able, were you blocked on Facebook?
Well, Facebook, forget about Facebook. I have to use my other account on Facebook as well. Facebook, I haven't been able to use my regular Dolores Pierce account on Facebook. Ever since that happened with whatchamacallit, when I did that show, we were talking about I'm trying to think what we were talking about. Then they went and they blocked my account. They took the show down. They went crazy, hazing stuff. So they still kind of give me trouble. So I just kind of on Facebook, I don't even use Dolores Pierce anymore for Facebook. For the show, I use my Carmedia account where it goes live over to there. So, it's like almost like they get obsessed with something and they just can't let something go.
Yeah. Yeah, they
We were
probably.
talking Kurds. It was the Kurds. That's what we were talking about, but it's the group in Syria. So it just put Facebook crazy attacking me for that. We talked about the Kurds in Iraq and how they had put their the human rights violation complaints in, to the UN. That show, everything was fine with that show. So the Kurds in Iraq, for us to talk about them was fine, but to talk about the group in Syria, all hell broke out.
Crazy.
And I just thought it would be, the responsible thing to do to talk about the Kurds in each different region.
Yes, that is the responsible thing to do.
But you can't.
These platforms are really, really, really annoying.
They are. So right now I have to YouTube. I put up a video that I don't know why they had a fit over it. So
They had to fit over a new video you put up.
Yes, last night I put up a video, but we've talked about that topic, and we've talked about that stuff already. But maybe they're just getting, who knows? Maybe the donors are complaining. Who knows what's going on?
So did you get a strike for last night's video?
Not the show video, but for a different video that I put up.
I see.
But it's stuff we've been talking about, and I've posted stuff about that and contrasting with different things. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it's hell to the fire.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm glad I have another channel to use
That
on
is
D
great.
Piers. Well, actually, it was under the name Dolores Piers, but I figured since I have the show with D's, I might as well change the name. I changed it to D Piers. So.
Okay. So once again, good night, everyone.
Yes, good night.
Okay, and we will see you tomorrow night, Dee, on your channel, right?
Yes, on D Piers channel.
Right.
So if you can subscribe to the channel, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, and you'll have a good show tomorrow.
Yes, and you'll be there to make it better.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, okay. If the creeks don't rise, I will.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks again, everybody. I'm gonna.
Yes, thanks and good night. Good night, Steve, Ghost Thoughts, Sandy, Lana, everybody. Good night. Good night, Bonnie.
Yeah. Good night, Steve Wolfbrand.
Yes.
You've been a little quiet tonight. Uncharacteristic.
Yes, yes. Maybe he's tired.
Maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Good night. Let me
Good night, everybody.